In this video, we are going to be continuing talking about the different biomolecules that are part of the fatty acid family. The first thing that we are going to be studying in section 15.3 has to do with waxes. Understand that waxes are going to have esters, and as I mentioned before, it is very important that you are familiar with the functional groups that are in these biomolecules. These waxes are formed by linking a fatty acid with a long chain alcohol. So as you can see here, we have in a box illustrating the ester bond that takes together the fatty acid and the long chain alcohol to make this wax. So remember that when we are putting a fatty acid or I should say specifically a carboxylic acid and an alcohol, that will allow the conversion of making an ester. Remember that we learned in chapter 14 that this is specifically doing under acid catalysis, but in nature you have molecules that we're going to study in later chapters that are called enzymes that allow these reactions to occur. So waxes are important because they are part of coatings that prevent water loss, for example, in the leaves of plants. In table 15.2 are some example of typical waxes. The main thing that you should get out of this slide is not to memorize the different waxes that we have. Just understand that waxes can come from animal sources or plant sources. And as you can see here, we have beeswax, which comes from an animal. We have carnauba wax, and we also have jojoba wax. The next member of the fatty acid family that we are going to be talking about is triacylglycerols. And these molecules are important because they are the major form of energy storage for animals. Maybe you haven't heard of triacylglycerols, but maybe you have heard the term triglycerides. It means the same thing. The reason why we call them triacylglycerols is because these molecules have 3 ester bonds and they have acyl groups. And acyl groups are these carbon oxygen double bonds. So that's where the acyl, that's where it's coming from. Now, as I just mentioned, as you can see, when it comes to these molecules, we're going to have 3 ester bonds, okay? So again, the chemistry of how a triacylglycerol should not be uncommon. Here we have an alcohol and a fatty acid making these ester bonds that are present in the triacylglycerols. Now, the alcohol molecule is actually a very particular one. This specifically, we're going to be using glycerol. And glycerol has the chemical formula CH2OH bonded to CHOH followed by another CH2OH. Okay, so if I highlight specifically, the proportion of glycerol in this molecule is going to be this part. And then we have fatty acids in it, specifically 3 fatty acids. Okay, that's where the prefix tri comes from. We have 1, 2, 3 components of the fatty acids. Okay, now as you can see, These esters, okay, are going to be utilizing as an alcohol the molecule of glycerol, which is a trihydroxy acid alcohol, which I drew in the corner, okay? And understand that, again, those esters come from the hydroxyl groups in the glycerol reacting with the carboxylic acid portions of those three fatty acids. Remember, carboxylic acid plus alcohol make esters, okay? I am not going to be grading you or testing you on the nomenclature for triacylglycerols, but it is important to know that when you are naming these molecules, you're going to be changing glycerol to glycerol, and then you're going to be naming the fatty acids as carboxylates. But again, I am not going to be testing you on nomenclature for triacylglycerols. As I mentioned previously, one of the main functions of triacylglycerols is for energy storage in animals, because in chapter 18, even though we are not going to be discussing this semester, it is explained how fat can actually be utilized to generate energy in the body. So, certain animals, as we know, undergo the process of hibernation, okay? And these animals that undergo the process of hibernation, they typically have food that has high caloric intake, meaning that they eat a lot of fat, because during the process of hibernation, they need to at least have some basic body functions like respiration in order to survive the process of hibernation. So, why is it that they have high caloric content in their diet? Because during the process of hibernation, they can utilize the fat that they gained as a source of energy to, at least in hibernation, continuing having their body functions. Understand that when it comes to triacylglycerols or triglycerides, they don't need to have the same fatty acids present. They can have different fatty acids present, and that's what we call the mixed triacylglycerol. So as you can see here, you have an example of a mixed triacylglycerol. So if you go through the worksheet, you will see that I actually highlighted the different fatty acids that can be found in examples of triacylglycerols. Make sure that you know, since you need the information of table 15.1, that you know how to identify fatty acids within a mixed triacylglycerol. So for example, the one that we have here in the slide contains stearic acid, oleic acid, and palmitic acid. The next thing that we're going to mention is the melting points of fats and oils, okay? So let's define what makes something a fat versus what makes something an oil, okay? And the reason why we talk fats and oils is because fats and oils are going to be examples of triglycerides, okay? They are going to be these molecules that come from the reaction of a glycerol molecule with three different fatty acids. So a fat, by definition, is going to be usually solid at room temperature, and we consider something a fat because it comes from animal sources, okay? Some examples of things that contain fat, we have meat, whole milk, butter, and cheese. In oil, on the other hand, it is usually liquid at room temperature, and it is usually obtained from a plant resource. So as you can see, that's why we have palm oil or coconut oil. So when it comes to fats and oils, remember that these triacylglycerols can have saturated fat in the fatty acids, or they can have unsaturated fats in the fatty acids. And we observe that depending on the composition of those fatty acids, remember that we have effects in the melting points, just like we explained in the previous video. So as you can see, a saturated fatty acid is going to have a higher melting point than an unsaturated fatty acid because they can pack together more tightly, similar to the analogy of having Pringle potato chips. And remember that saturated fatty acids are usually found in animal fats. There are very few examples of oils that have high saturated fat contents, but we do have some. So, for example, coconut oil and palm oil are going to be examples of molecules that, or I should say, triglycerides or triacylglycerols that do have a consistency of more solid, but even though they are coming from plant sources. Let's look at this more closely in the following graph. So, the following graph gives you the percentage of saturated and unsaturated fatty acids in fats and oils, okay? So, we know that vegetable oils have low melting points. And the reason why that is because they have a higher percentage of unsaturated fatty acids than we compare it to animal fats, okay? So, if we look here in terms of two things, the content of saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and polyunsaturated fats, we can define why there are some fats and oils that are solids and why most oils are liquid, okay? Notice that not only having more saturated fat means higher melting point, it also means having a solid physical state at room temperature. And as we can see here, all of the different fatty acids triacylglycerols that we have here that come from animal sources, so like beef tallow or butter, the reason why they are solid is because they have a high percentage of saturated fat. So if we look at this graph, okay, we can see that, for example, beef tallow is going to have around 48% saturated fat, and it has around 50% monounsaturated fat. So having that high percentage of saturated fatty acids in the triacylglycerol gives it a solid consistency. If we compare it to butter, butter has even higher percentage of saturated fat. Coconut oil, even though it's an oil, because it comes from a plant source, it is solid at room temperature because it has more saturated fat. Again, those fatty acids can stack together just like Pringle potato chips, and that's why it forms that solid consistency at room temperature. We already discussed that most oils are liquid and they have lower melting points compared to saturated fats. And as we can see, many of the oils that you can see here, they have a liquid consistency because they have higher monounsaturated fats or even polyunsaturated fats.